Hello and welcome. It's Arran here at the Battle of Prestonpans Jacobite Museum in East Lothian, Scotland, with the 10th video update on our What If interactive wargame campaign, imagining what might have happened in 1745 and 6 if the strategic decisions had been taken by some of our social media followers. Welcome to those of you who are new subscribers. I hope you've caught up on what's been happening so far, and thanks for staying with us, those of you who've been with us since the beginning back in January, or should I say, September 1745. We're into a new year now. It's January 1746, and although there hasn't been a tabletop engagement since the last video, I thought it was important to fill you in on how the campaign has been unfolding. We're in a really critical phase of operations now. So just stepping back to the last few days of 1745, we had the two principal armies, the army of the Duke of Cumberland for George II and the army of Charles Edward Stuart for the Jacobites, fighting it out in County Durham after the Jacobites had marched down through Newcastle. The resulting battle at Spennymoor near Bishop Auckland effectively broke into two separate operations, one with the British army attacking the Jacobites in their strong position on the ridgeline, whilst at the other end of the battlefield the Jacobite Highlanders swept to glory across the moor itself. With a thin screen of cavalry, the Duke of Cumberland at the end of the day managed to limp away with some of his infantry regiments from the centre relatively intact, leaving the Jacobites in possession of the battlefield. So Charles Edward Stuart has won an important battlefield victory, destroying a large portion of the Duke of Cumberland's field army and, importantly, providing some comfort now to his English adherents that maybe, just maybe, it was worth the risk of marching out to support him. So just looking back at our now familiar map of this part of County Durham, we have the Jacobite left on the Spennymoor itself, the centre at Kirk Merrington and the right at Ferry Hill. By the end of the day of the battle, Cumberland's surviving units were retreating to Sunderland Bridge where they'd begun, and presumably from there on to Durham. The Jacobites have succeeded not only in defeating Cumberland, but separating him from London. There is now no field army between the Jacobites here at Bishop Auckland and London itself. So we gave the decision to our Jacobite voters on Facebook. What were they to do next? And of course, you would expect them to vote for an immediate march on the capital. But they did not. Our Jacobites have shown caution throughout this campaign when making their strategic decisions, and this was evident again on this vote. The decision was taken that it was dangerous to leave a force operating in the Jacobite rear whilst they marched on London, and so instead the army would march to Durham and there pin down anything that remained of Cumberland's army, if necessary, laying siege to Durham before proceeding southwards. When Charles Edward and his army gets there, they are actually able to enter Durham unopposed, because as he withdrew from the battlefield, Cumberland had determined not to march and stay in the city, but instead to strike cross-country towards Hartlepool. Now, this decision was based on the fact that Cumberland's principal objective was to get his army back into a position from which it could help protect London. Now, at this point, we looked at various options for whether the Jacobites could discover exactly where Cumberland's army had gone, but given the paucity of cavalry forces available to the Jacobites following on from earlier defeats and setbacks, we discovered that actually it was too late before they realised where exactly Cumberland's army had gone. We did allow elements of Charles Edward's army to track Cumberland towards Hartlepool, but given that Hartlepool is a walled town and its defences were intact in the 18th century, we decided that it would be impossible for the Jacobites to be able to prevent the Duke of Cumberland from doing what he had set out to do, which was, of course, to evacuate his forces by sea. Now, we determined that Cumberland could achieve this before the Jacobites would be in a position to interfere with the operation by laying siege to Hartlepool. So, in fact, the Jacobites, by deciding to march from their victory field towards Durham, had lost a couple of days in trying to identify where Cumberland was and what he was doing. However, once it was clear that Cumberland was evacuating, we determined that Charles Edward no longer had any reason to argue against a march directly on the capital, and the Jacobite army has turned south. So we now have a competition to see whether the Jacobites, who are thrusting southwards towards the capital, can get there before Cumberland's ships can bring the remains of his army to bolster the defence forces that are gathering around King George. There's also a bit of an arms race happening across England now, as King George's men are desperately recruiting as many men into the local militias as possible, and in due course, all of those militia units, when raised, are ordered to start falling back on London. The battlefield victory in England has also given the Jacobite recruiters a bonus as well, and so 2 infantry regiments have been raised in England for the Jacobites, one in Northumberland and one over in Lancashire. Now, one of those is destined to take over the garrison at Newcastle, hopefully freeing up a clan regiment to join with the Prince's main body as it heads south, whereas Townley's infantry, as you see here, are heading across country to try and link up with the Prince himself. So both armies are being augmented by fresh recruits as the campaign draws towards the capital. Now, some weeks back, when Newcastle was under siege, George II put in motion the transfer of Hessian regiments over into Great Britain to try and prop up his faltering cause. Now, historically, these units came over in February 1746. They're coming over a bit earlier this time, and hopefully they will get to London in time to prevent the Jacobites being able to simply walk through the door. So there's now a 3-way race to the capital. Cumberland and his men, the Hessians coming from overseas, and of course Charles Edward, who by the 14th of January has reached the River Trent at Newark. What could be more complex and exciting than a 3-way race towards London? A 4-way race towards London, of course. The Jacobites, when they had crossed the border and taken Newcastle, had triggered the decision in Paris for an invasion force to be assembled on the north coast of France. Once Prince Charles Edward had actually reached the River Trent, that was the trigger built into our campaign for that invasion force to cross the Channel. Now it turned on the roll of a dice. Would that invasion force be able to get through the Royal Navy's blockades and get successfully to the south of England? One of the compromises in this campaign is that everything has a consequence. In order to free up naval resources to transfer the Hessians and to free up naval resources to evacuate Cumberland from Hartlepool, there was a weakening of the naval blockades, and the French have been able to cross, and with a brilliant dice roll, that French invasion force is now on its way towards Kent. So as we reach the midpoint of January 1746, George II is holding London with just the Guards brigades and a small force of militias. Charles Edward and the Jacobite army are crossing the Trent and symbolically entering the southern half of England. The same day, the Duke of Cumberland and the remnants of his army from the north disembark at Chatham Docks. The Hessians are at sea coming to their aid, and the French are at sea coming to fight them. In the next few weeks, the future of Great Britain will surely be decided. Stay with us.